Hello everyone, Alan Sens with you again, and welcome to this segment on strategic bombing and war crimes. So let's get started. So here are the learning objectives for this segment. By the time we're done, you should be able to identify the primary sources of war law and international humanitarian law. And you should be able to explain the principles of distinction and proportionality. Just a quick bumper sticker definition of war crimes: violations of international laws that govern the conduct of warfare. That's not a particularly long or comprehensive definition, but it'll work for us at this point. The collection of international laws addressing war crimes is commonly referred to as war law or international humanitarian law. This body of law is established primarily in the form of treaties between states. And the centerpieces of current international humanitarian law are the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1977. A protocol is simply an addition to or a supplement that's added on to an existing treaty. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 are organized into 4 conventions: the Convention to Protect War Victims, the Sick and the Wounded, the Shipwrecked, Prisoners of War, and Civilians in the Hands of an Adverse Party, and, to some extent, all civilians in the territories of the countries in a conflict. The 4th Geneva Convention can be interpreted to prohibit strategic bombing, although there's actually no explicit mention of strategic bombing in Convention 4. In addition, we have the Geneva Protocols, the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1977. This is the focal point of war law on the question of strategic bombing, and the 2 key principles that are enshrined in the additional protocols are the principles of distinction and proportionality. Under the principle of distinction, parties to an armed conflict must always distinguish between civilians and civilian objects on the one hand, and combatants and military targets on the other. Specifically, the Additional Protocol 1, Article 51 of the 1977 Additional Protocols, there is an explicit ban on indiscriminate attacks in general and area bombardment in particular. Paragraph 5, in fact, specifically states that an attack by bombardment by any method or means which treats as a single military objective a number of clearly separated and distinct military objectives located in a city, town, village, or other area containing a similar concentration of civilians or civilian objects is prohibited. Bombarding areas that contain solely military targets is permitted, however. Under the principle of proportionality, attacks are prohibited if the collateral damage expected from any attack would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Again, in the 1977 Protocols, Additional Protocol 1, Article 57, the Convention states, "In the conduct of military operations, constant care shall be taken to spare the civilian populations, civilians, and civilian objects." This includes refrain from deciding to launch any attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So what does all this mean in practical terms? Well, it means a number of different things. First of all, in the conventions then, if we have a number of military targets, so let me draw a couple of targets here, and these are solely military targets. It is perfectly permissible under international humanitarian law and war law to attack these targets, to bomb them, using area bombardment, aerial bombardment, strategic bombing, whatever you want to call it. Now, if these targets were all inside a city, it would not be permissible to carpet bomb or area bomb the entire city in order to destroy those specific military targets. That would violate the principle of distinction. You can still attack these targets, however, inside the city, but your attacks on them must be targeted in such a way that the damage to the surrounding civilian areas and the loss of life to civilians is proportionate to the military advantage of attacking those targets. That's the principle of proportionality. Now, of course, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, well, how in the world do you make a judgment about the value of the loss of civilian life next to the value of the military advantage of attacking those targets? And that is precisely the problem. How to make that judgment, how to interpret this kind of judgment is one of the most serious challenges facing international humanitarian law with respect to aerial bombardment and strategic bombing generally. So, were the bombings of Rotterdam, Hamburg, Dresden, Nanjing, or Tokyo war crimes? One of the things we have to remember is that any debate over the legality of the strategic bombing of cities during or before World War II would apply treaty law that was not in place at the time, right? The Geneva Conventions, 1949, Additional Protocols, 1977. Well, that's after World War II. But there's still a question of the morality of those bombings and whether or not they were justified. And so using the contemporary law gives us some measure of how we might consider the morality or the ethics of strategic bombing even as it occurred before World War II or during World War II. So I hope this has helped you being able to identify the primary sources of war law and international humanitarian law. And I hope you have a good sense now of the principles of distinction and proportionality, as well as some of the obvious challenges with how we make judgments about distinction and proportionality. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the basis of international humanitarian law and war law as it pertains to strategic bombing. Now, obviously, the big connection for us here is the link to using the atomic bomb and the ethics of the use of that bomb against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. And that is one of the questions we're going to have to examine very soon in a future segment. Thanks very much. I'll see you all soon.